So good evening, everyone. Today we have a very distinguished set of people with us to discuss, one of the new book on a new idea of India, and the book has actually become one of the best sellers on Amazon in a record no span of time. And the two authors, need no introduction. They are basically people that I sort of admire a lot, and in fact, a lot of us actually admire a lot. So Harsh Gupta and Rajiv Mantri have written this brilliant book, which was apparently supposed to be a collection of their essays over the years, but now that you read the book, you realize that it's a lot more than that. So to discuss the book, I have both the authors along with Niranjan sir from IDFC, who happens to be again one of the more sort of very well-known columnists with Mint and a leading researcher in his field. So today we're going to discuss the book, and we're going to separate the sort of discussion into five specific sections. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a discussion on each of these aspects, and basically try to understand what was the story behind this book, and what was rather the story behind some of the provocative policy prescriptions that have come out from the book. Uh, but before I begin, I actually want to know what really, what was the real experience of writing a book, and how it really emerged from being a collection of essays to, a sort of a compelling read, which actually forces the reader to think.
Okay, I'll take that. So Rajiv and I have been writing columns in Mint actually. That's where we started first. I think the first column we wrote together was in 2009 or 10. And I must pause here right now and first of all thank Dr. Niranjan Rajdaksha so much, because actually he or somebody junior to him was always the person to receive our columns over the years, and his mentorship and guidance helped us a lot to reach where we are. And so thank you so much, Niranjan, for your time today as well, for taking it out and all the help over the years. So we were writing
Yes,
columns.
thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. So, Karan, we were writing columns over the years. In 2013 December, I think we responded in Mint to a column by Dr. Ashutosh Varshney of Brown University, in which he had mentioned that the idea of India, according to him, includes the idea of minorities as minorities, perhaps over and above them being individual citizens. And that's led to a set of debates, first in Mint, then in Indian Express, between Rajiv and me on one side, later joined by who's now the Honorable Minister of Finance, Nirmala Sitaraman, and Ashutosh Varshney on the other side, Javed Anand, as well as other people. And we said that society can see people as groups, that's fine, but the state should see them as individual citizens. And that is when we first used the phrase "a new idea of India." Then we wrote a column, I think in 2015 or 16, Rajiv, for Swarajya, the inaugural issue, 2016 maybe. Yeah, so in 2016 we wrote a new idea of India. That is the first.
Yeah, it was actually 2014.
Sorry, 2014 itself. Yes, the inaugural issue of the relaunched Swarajya magazine, which again we were honored that it was launched by Shri ji, and so that's when we kind of expanded on that. And then we thought of having an anthology of all our columns: economics, politics, philosophy. But then Rajiv and I thought that A, they are very disjointed, and B, they are also partially outdated. So we went back to Niranjan and we went back to other editors. We said, do we have your permission to use our own material, kind of modify it, add new stuff, and make a new book? And actually now more than half of the book, I would say, is new material. So I'll leave it at that.
Interesting. Rajiv? Yes, sir. Rajiv,
Yeah.
so do you want something to that?
No, yeah. So that was kind of the logistical genesis of this. But at a sort of higher level, I would say over the years, Harsh and I, because we've written more than 50 columns together, I think. And often we start out with one perspective, and by the time we are done, we have sort of really modified our views, and we find ourselves in a different place. And it also happens that we have we start with kind of a disagreement between us, but then he comes over to my position, or I come over to his position as we start discussing a topic. And so this book was really a culmination of all those kind of debates that we've had, and frankly also includes debates with people like Dr. Rajadhyaksh and so many others, Professor Panagaria. We are very lucky to know so many people who've educated us actually over the years. And it really brings together many different strains of thought, many different strains of ideation from all that manthan, so to say.
So, one of the key themes that I really liked about the book was the collectivism versus individual rights, which was incidentally the genesis or the initiation of this entire long journey that you just illustrated. So, I really want to understand the key difference, on the economic aspect of collective rights versus individual rights. And I think this becomes very important because there's a lot of discussion happening around markets and why markets fail, and it's all sort of ideologically driven in a country like India. So how do you three view this particular sort of problem of market failures and at the same time collective versus individual rights, all sort of influencing the policy discourse?
I would request actually Niranjan to sort of speak a little about this and this particular topic, and then also maybe broadly about the book as well, and then Harsh and I can answer.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks, Karan. Thanks, Harsh, Rajiv, for inviting me here.
Thank you so much.
I remember that I first met Rajiv in 2009 for coffee in Calcutta, right, Rajiv? And
Yes, yes.
I think
That was when I think the Mint Calcutta edition was going to be launched,
yes,
and
exactly. And then through Rajiv, I got to know Harsh, and I've always enjoyed, at times agreeing with them, at times disagreeing with them, but it's always been intellectual, enriching experience. All my interactions with them. See, this book, I think really, Karan, what you're saying is right. It sort of raises some very important questions for 21st century India. And if you read the fourth chapter, which is on the economy, which I think is what we're going to focus on today, see that chapter, the headline is a provocative one, that profit is no longer a dirty word or something of that sort, taking off from something which Nehru said, to the contrary. And I agree with them that, you can't think of an economy without profits. I think Rajiv and Harsh have taken a very nuanced stance on this state versus market issue. And if you read this chapter carefully, what is actually striking is that they don't just think of the economy in terms of crude growth rates or uh, the normal sort of narrative in India is whether markets lead to higher growth or planning leads to higher growth. I think they're taking a broadly philosophical position. So, in fact, the very beginning of the chapter, it opens with the redistribution issue that, should a modern nation state have redistribution? Agree with it, but how do we do it? That is their disagreement. Should it be through, like rights written into laws, or it should be through more market-friendly ways like vouchers, etc. So that very first opening, in a way, takes you by surprise, and I thought that was, and then they move into issues which are again broadly philosophical, which is like the morality of markets, then how do markets uh, fit in with our own sort of cultural or our own, the Indian tradition, so to say. I have some disagreements perhaps there, but this it's the vastness of the vision of this chapter which I thought was very attractive. And then obviously they go into the more recent issues of reforms of the impact of the telecom revolution, then this entire new issue of Atmanirbhar Bharat. So it sits in very well with the broad theme of the book. It's not a book about instrumentalities, it's a book about the bigger questions, and they framed it very well. So I'll stop here, and I don't know if they agree with my reading of it, but
No, Niranjan, I think that's an excellent overview summary of chapter 4, which is profit is not a dirty word, as Nehruji said to JRD Tata. So he said it's a dirty word, and we are saying it's not a dirty word. And you're right. We actually try to frame it first in very normative and philosophical views, and saying only after that can we come to the instrumentality of it. So as you mentioned about the welfare, you said it's, we divide it into two parts: how much help versus how to help. And we say quite often in two, three parts of the book, for education, for healthcare, and other places, that how much help is a normative, it's a political question. How to help is relatively a bit more technocratic question, and where you can have, for the same amount of tax rupees, much more efficient outcomes. And what happens in political discourse is often the two get conflated. So that's just one small example of how policy, public policy, economic public policy is at so many layers, right? There is a philosophical disagreement between different parts of society. And then there is something where hopefully more economic literacy can narrow down the choices to better economic policies. And then I'm not saying it's a pure science. There will always be disagreement. There is an art, as you know better than any of us here. But the idea is at least you can narrow down the basket of choices to something which is efficient on all sides. And you're right, the last part, Atmanirbhar capitalism, is where we kind of have a slightly heterodox view, which we'll discuss in a moment. But also, I thought the book kind of, it was not out of place with the book. It's not a political or philosophy book with one or two economic chapters, but this idea of individual rights versus the collective, and how do you leverage the collective in exceptional cases? How do you leverage size of India without falling for the diseconomies of scale? That is one of the nuanced areas, right? Because India is not Singapore in many ways. So I think that is a tension we try to tease out towards the second half of this chapter. Rajiv?
No, and I think what a lot of people tend to forget is that economics as a discipline offers tactics and not strategy. So the strategy on the larger, bigger picture really flows from a political position, and then you have economic answers to some of those questions. So, for example, the question of welfare, which Niranjan alluded to, which is the opening part of chapter 4. I don't think there is a disagreement in India that there is a clear case for welfare. So that is kind of a politically settled question. Those who say that there should be no welfare, well, that is taking a political stance against public welfare in a poor country like India. So often I think economists tend to, who argue against that, and I mean, there are not that many of them, but there is a certain section that argues against even that. I think that kind of devolves into kind of ideological demagoguery, which we try to stay away from in chapter 4, and we try to sort of offer more ideas that would take India to a sustainable high growth rate, address the problem of the challenge of job creation, and certain other kind of unique, specific challenges that a country of India's size faces.
And we also feel that, as just to quickly add, it's not so much about state versus market, it is state and market. And this is something maybe Rajiv and I would not have agreed 10 years ago, where we were kind of freshly minted libertarians. And we still are moderate libertarians in a way, but the issue is, see, libertarianism is not anarchy. If that would be the case, Somalia would be the richest part of the world. It has no state. But we are not talking about Somalia as any kind of utopia. We are, in fact, often talk about places like Sweden and Scandinavia, where the markets, where actually you have very pro-business climates, but you also have very welfare states. So this shows that it's not a unidimensional kind of scale where you're on this side or on that side. There are 2 or 3 axes, not just one axis. So you actually need a competent state. You need state capacity to manage and regulate an increasingly complex and diverse industrial and post-industrial economy. And therefore, these things go hand in hand. It's more about minimizing waste than saying, which is why I think Narendra Modi's slogan of minimum government, maximum governance, the second part is also equally important. Now, relatively intelligent people can agree or disagree to what extent we've achieved that in the last 6 years. But I think the slogan encapsulates it very well. It's not just minimum government, like Ronald Reagan would have said. It's minimum government, maximum governance.
I think the nuance which is there in this chapter, which I really liked, is that, as Harsh and Rajiv both said, the state and market are not binaries, right? It's always an evolving balance.
Absolutely.
And a lot is contextual, So one of my disagreements with them has always been on Nehru, right? I've always believed that in the 1950s, there was some reason to follow that path. Now, to what extent it was sustainable, we can, I know I've written about the flaws of that strategy, but that strategy was not completely thoughtless, I think as the world changes, this balance between state and market keeps evolving. So again, 91, the collapse of the Soviet Union and this, that changed it. Again, now with this entire deglobalization, the increasingly, recognition across the world that China has to be contained, that changes. So I don't think these things can be written down in stone forever. These are not unchanging truths, means economics has some unchanging truths at the base, but a lot of the edifice of policy is contextual. And I think, hats off to Rajiv and Harsh for really pinning some. I found some of the comments, in the book, in this chapter especially, like extremely good. Like, they say somewhere on this issue of digital technologies that some goods which are tradable will not become tradable in the future, and non-tradables will become tradable. Now, this is a throwaway line, but actually it has profound implications for how we think about India. Somewhere else they say that the state is transforming itself from a blunt hammer to a precise scalpel. I thought that was a really good line. So I think there are lots of these insights, and broadly they are built around a very nuanced view of how do you think of the state, how do you think of the market. And I absolutely agree, in a country with our history, our levels of poverty, you cannot wish away the state, you cannot wish away the need for the state to help people.
I fully agree. And just to add there, it's not we actually have probably come around to your view about Nehru to some extent in this book. And both Rajiv and I were positively surprised, and even in two ways. One, I'll quickly stay on the political side, but not spend too much time on it. Firstly, even throughout the book, we say the Nehruvian way is not necessarily the same as what Nehru himself would have done. There is an element of Gandhi versus Gandhi and Buddha versus Buddhist, Ambedkar versus Ambedkarite, actually, more than anything else today. So that's quickly on the political side, not going into the politics aspect. But even on the economic aspect, and I think this will actually be a good segue into Atmanirbhar capitalism in a couple of minutes, we do think that what Nehruji tried in the 1950s in terms of diversified industrial base, a mixed economy, was not a wrong strategy actually now. And now that at least I think about it, I think that actually the overvalued rupee in the 50s was a big reason. And because of national pride, we refused to devalue the rupee. And once we refused to devalue the rupee, obviously imports were artificially cheaper and exports were artificially expensive for others to buy. And then you actually had this import substitution problem leading to license Raj. Import substitution and license Raj are conceptually separate. What happened is, because the rupee was overvalued in a real effective exchange rate term, just in plain language, it was overvalued because the inflation differential was high, but we had fixed rates at that time. We did not have floating rates. And because of national pride, the same the way the UK took a long time to devalue the pound against the dollar in the 50s and 60s. I don't know if you've seen The Crown on Netflix. And there's a big drama in one episode about that. So because we didn't do that, we finally did that in 65, 66, I think, under Indira Gandhi. That is what led to, because we started clamping on imports, and then therefore we started issuing domestic capex private licenses, and then it had its own constituency of cronyism. But Nehru's strategy of building on the two world wars industrial diversified base per se was not wrong. He overreached in agriculture, he tried to collectivize it. He overreached definitely in terms of public sector units in some cases. But for the 50s, it was not wrong. By the 60s, it was very clear it is wrong.
Yeah, so I agree with you, Harsh. So I think that Nehru's, the strategy was correct, right? That to address mass poverty, you need rapid growth. It's amazing that in the early plans, most of the focus is on raising the investment rate and achieving growth. The second is to, as you said, diversify, and diversify not just for the sake of diversification, the structural transformation of the Indian economy, which actually, if you read, Ambedkar spoke about it, Savarkar spoke about it, Subhash Chandra Bose spoke about it. Most people, Madan Mohan Malaviya spoke about it. Other than perhaps Gandhiji, most people would have agreed with this strategy. Also, I think in the Cold War years, I think this idea that you need strategic autonomy, and therefore, which is an issue coming back into Indian discourse today. And in those years, strategic autonomy basically meant that you have to produce your own machine goods and your steel, So I think when it went wrong, the Nehruvian strategy is one, it overestimated the ability of the state to make these decisions rather than private enterprise. They completely misread the fact that global trade was about to, have a massive boom, and this export pessimism was there. So there were flaws, but I don't think I think the real problem started after Shastriji passed away, and then the 1969 turn to the left by Mrs. Gandhi, which she again by 80 had realized the mistake. But I think those were the real critical years. But anyway, that's history. So perhaps we'd like to move ahead.
So, interestingly, there's been a discussion about exchange rates and why it was seen as a symbol of pride. And there's this discussion about the prospects of our rupee appreciating and what it really means going forward. Uh, uh, Now, the question that I really have for all three of you is that on the external front, I know that Harsh, for instance, has been very, vocally in support of capital account mobility, an open capital account. But interestingly, the IEO of the International Monetary Fund came out with a report which, for a change, actually supported financial controls and management of financial capital. So I really want to understand that. What are your views? Because I think over here probably there's going to be slight disagreement that the three of you might have in terms of what is the appropriate role of foreign capital in the context of India's development, and whether it has really played the kind of positive role that it is assumed to play. And while I leave it at that, I want to ask another specific question, since we're talking about rights and reforms. This question keeps coming back, that for whom do we reform? Do we reform for foreign investors, or do we sort of reform for our own private investors? And I really want to ask Dr. Niranjan his views regarding this particular sort of dichotomy or the trade-off between reforming for attracting foreign capital and for pushing up domestic private sort of investment in India.
Yes, see, Karan, I don't think you can separate the two, frankly,
I agree.
Because if you have global production networks, right, then FDI is not just a way of bringing in financial capital. India has, all said and done, even despite the recent slip in the savings rate, it has a strong pool of domestic capital. But with FDI comes links to global supply chains. It gives access to technology. It gives access to knowledge and ways of doing things. So I think there are, there are important spillovers from global, from FDI especially. You see that, just to give an example, if, Sri Perumbudur, where, the Koreans set up their car manufacturing, then, the entire supply chain came, things grew around it. So I don't think we should look at FDI versus domestic. I think, unless it's in strategic sectors, right? So there is then a reason to make this distinction. For example, in defense or in telecom or in banking, there are specific sectors where, for reasons of national security or, national strategy, you may make this discussion or distinction. But generally, I think that economic policy should focus on increasing the number of efficient firms in this country. Now, if those firms are based from FDI or domestic or JVs, I think you should be agnostic towards it.
Yeah, so I agree. So I fully agree on that. So I'll take the first part of the question on, you asked a question about open capital account. So before answering that, I think my view, as you rightly mentioned, Karan, is that we should have, not right now, but say I've written a column in Mint only a couple of months ago that by 2025, for example, we should target an open capital account. But I want to first step back and say a moment that the capital account and the trade account are intrinsically related. How are they related? They're related through the mechanism of the currency valuation. So what happens is, if you actually have, so Danny Roderick famously said that in a completely free market 101 efficient sense, the currency valuation should not matter over time. But he finds that if you have a real effective exchange rate undervalued to begin with, then that kind of boosts exports. So there's a famous paper of Danny Roderick. And empirically, it seems reasonable and fair to me, because there are a lot of these contractual kind of market frictions, which if you kind of just kind of boom. So if you have to think about it, why I'm saying is a trade tariff of 10%, universal on all goods, is conceptually similar to a 10% currency undervaluation, right? If you artificially. So in that sense, you cannot completely separate the two. Now, why am I saying they're related? So let us say right now we have $550 odd billion of foreign exchange reserves. Let's say if we target, say, roughly $1 trillion by 2025. What does it mean by capital account mobility? So what, as you mentioned, you hinted at IEO of the IMF saying, let's have some capital controls. So whenever there is a weak dollar phase and dollars are rushing in, people say, inward mein control dal do. So the question is, why not liberalize outflows instead? The point is to make sure that it is not completely off balance in one way. You can achieve the same by increasing the liberalized remittance scheme amount from say $250,000 per individual per year to $500,000, or if required $1 million, whatever the number might be. You will do it gradually. So the why India still thinks like a small economy. And the reason why that is important is you must have seen China went from 7.2 CNY to USD to like 6.8 in the last couple of months. And part of the reason is a rush of global capital is coming in. China is now in all the 3 global bond indices. And what that means is, despite a geopolitical clash, which we've not seen for the last 30, 40 years, it is the rush of money and the negative zero interest rates which makes Chinese 3% of 10Y absolutely mouth-wateringly delightful for foreign investors. India, on the other hand, has 6%. India has never defaulted. India is in a very favorable position geopolitically. The so-called West and Japan want to make India stand up against China, right? Remember, China started prospering when it went to the US side against Soviet Union. So this geopolitical context is very important to understand, that we actually can have an open capital account at a smaller GDP compared to China, other things being equal, because of the geopolitical advantage versus our tailwind versus their headwind. And what is the upside of this? The upside of this is we get much lower borrowing costs. We have an artificially higher rate, I think, compared to the global market. And the reason was, so far the rupee was depreciating. So then, see, this is how everything is connected. But I think the rupee does not depreciate in nominal terms going forward because of 2 reasons. One, the inflation differentials are going to be much lower compared to the last 20 years. A, we have inflation targeting. B, in general, inflation has fallen. And secondly, we have now entered a weak dollar phase compared to the last 8-9 years. So if you have a nominally stable currency and you are building a foreign exchange reserves, why will you stop building those reserves? Instead, keep on building them and go for an open capital account, have an investment boom, try to redirect it more towards infrastructure instead of kind of consumption or residential real estate. All those macro potential things are fine, but have a 5-year roadmap. We have been delaying this. We started thinking Tarapur Committee Report 196, then 97 happened. We thought Tarapur Committee Report 2, and then 2008 crash happened. Now we are in 2020. And I'm sorry to say, most people are risk averse, and we have to stop being risk averse about this. That's my view.
No, and I think that's a great summary by Harsh. I obviously do agree with him. I will just add on that point of, there is I think there is a saying in risk management actually, that don't create your risk control systems based on the previous crisis, because the next crisis is not going to be like the last crisis. So I think what does tend to happen is many people tend to get scarred by one experience, and then everything tends to be dictated by that experience. So after GFC, we were like, oh my God, we never want to have this again. So what can we do to prevent it? And we go to one extreme, whereas there are problems that emerge in some other part of the financial sector. So I think that should be kept in mind in a general sense.
Although I must say that I'm still very much in the Jagdish Bhagwati school as far as this issue goes, that I think trade liberalization is more important than capital account liberalization. So I think keeping the current account open is more important than, but I think this is a debate we can have another 1 hour about. So I think we should move on.
Yeah, I'll just say one line which I wrote in that column. I said, first of all, we are extremely lucky to have both Dr. Jagdish Bhagwati and Dr. Panagaria kind of endorse this book, despite what we wrote about kind of moderate trade sanctions in an Alexander Hamiltonian sense. And by the way, I just want to flag the government.
No, it really shows the intellectual greatness, actually.
Yes, the openness. And I would say, by the way, the government just a couple of days floated an idea that they'll have a sunset clause on those tariffs for 5 years. After 5 years. So I just want to say the government is also, after trying everything and out of frustration, has done this. And then we can discuss whether the RBI let the currency appreciate too much in 2018. But I don't want to go into a blame game. I'll simply say that what I said was a $1 trillion economy, a $3 trillion economy, and a $5 trillion economy is very different in the sense that the larger you get, the more power you have not to be overwhelmed by open capital, but you have more power to shape open trade. And the smaller you are, the vice versa it is. Now, maybe that effect does not come in at 3 trillion. Maybe that effect comes in 5 or 7 trillion. That's an empirical question.
So the analogy actually we have in the book is we draw an analogy from me make this point that the larger is for stronger pull it has, and the size matters essentially.
That's an interesting point on the importance of size. But I want to go back to the issue of current account and capital account distinction. That Dr. Niranjan just mentioned, and I want to go a bit more into this because today even Dr. Rajan has said that we are going back towards import substitution and that it won't do well. But as it comes out in the book, both the authors do seem to suggest that import substitution might just work this time around. So I really want to understand where is the disagreement on this particular issue. Is it more
Well,
philosophical or is it more on the
no,
policy?
Karan, I think it's an excellent question. I'll tell you where the disagreement is very simple. The disagreement is, as I hinted earlier, that import substitution this time is not coexisting with the license Raj. In fact, it is existing with very, very, very domestic free markets compared to the 1960s or 70s. It is existing with a very liberal FDI regime across sectors, with the exception now of China. It is existing with a very, very reasonably valued and floating currency. It is existing with all these technology transfers. The only thing that we are doing is we are giving a very small kind of road bump, saying to this, forget the Indian domestic guys, just telling the foreigners, you only sell in India, you sell to Indians, but just manufacture in India. And what we do in the book is we just take a quick example of two sectors. We take the example of automobiles and we take the example of consumer electronics like smartphones. And what we say is the automobiles have always had tariffs in India. And we are very self-sufficient in it. In fact, in two-wheelers, we are great exporters, including in some four-wheeler auto components. But if you look at the cell phone electronics and the small handheld electronics or laptops and all that, in 1996, we signed something called the ITA, Information Technology Agreement of WTO, when we directly went to zero tariffs, unlike, for example, the auto or auto ancillary industry. And by 2000, we had less value-add manufacturing in that sector than we had in 1990. And we were completely overwhelmed by and the entire manufacturing went to East Asia. So if we had done that in a more phased manner, we could have kept a lot of manufacturing in India. And even now we haven't, forget China, we have a free trade agreement with ASEAN. A lot of stuff, even if it does not come from China, will just come directly via Vietnam, whether it is value add, whether it is legally, illegally routed from southern provinces of China to Vietnam. We don't know, we can't verify beyond the point. So, if you have to think like an entrepreneur and not just an economist, most entrepreneurs are very happy to go to China and go to a trade fair and import. And Alexander Hamilton said, he used the word inertia, forces of habit. And when he said, let us have some tariffs, he, in his trade report on manufacturers, 1792, he submitted to George Washington and US Congress. He said, let us actually have some tariffs. And the analogy we use is like India is the US, UK is the China, and France is the US. France is our ally in both political and economic terms. And my professor at Dartmouth College, Douglas Irwin, is one of the most famous free traders of this sort. And his argument against Alexander Hamilton, because he has to make an argument, right? America throughout the 19th century had 40% weighted average import tariffs on manufactured goods. People forget America is not a laissez-faire economy at all. You can read Robert Allen and other people. And Douglas Irwin says, agar wo tariff nahi hota, and I respect all his scholarship otherwise, but his view is if there were no tariffs, America would have industrialized even faster. Well, that's a counterfactual, and you can, there's no way to prove or disprove it.
Yeah.
So I'll just leave it at that.
So can I come in here, Karan, before
Yes,
Rajiv gets his? I'm sorry, Rajiv, but
No, go for it. Go for it,
Harsh has
please.
been. See, I think there are a couple of issues why I disagree with Harsh and Rajiv on this issue. And I'm not at all, I know them well enough to know that they are not blind protectionists. So let's keep that out of the way. See, I think there are two issues. I think one is that the structure of global production is very different from what it was in the 19th century or in the 18th century. It's global supply chain. So what actually moves across borders is not finished goods, but inputs, intermediate goods. And therefore, this is the famous Lerner symmetry theorem that an import tax actually works like an export tax. So it has the same economic impact. So I think we have to be very careful about that. And secondly, since I mentioned Bhagwati, see, one of Professor Bhagwati's classic papers was sometime in the 60s with V.K. Ramaswamy, where he said that if you're not competitive because of a domestic distortion, then the optimal policy response is a subsidy to deal with that domestic distortion, not to have an import tariff, So I think that's a very, very perceptive way of how to, so if India doesn't have infrastructure or power, then you give domestic fiscal subsidies to deal with that problem, don't protect. But leave that aside. See, these are broad, philosophical debates. But I just, the reason Atmanirbhar Bharat, I have some questions about it. And the Prime Minister actually has not articulated exactly what he means by it. So, and I think it's a good thing, this sort of strategic ambiguity, because it could be. See, there are two or three things. One is, we look at 3 trillion and say India is a large economy. Actually, India, it's not so. Because if you break that 3 trillion down, about only about 2/3 of it is domestic consumption, right? The rest is domestic market. About 40% of that is food and energy, which is like non-discretionary stuff. So then you're down to 1.2 trillion. And then a lot of it is also, just services like education, etc. And a lot of it is from the unorganized sector. So the actual domestic discretionary consumption market for large firms is very small. It's not more than $1 trillion. It just, the scale is completely over. We think about it, $3 trillion economy, but you break it down. Now, I've written about this in Mint, that if this is the size of the market, it will grow undoubtedly. Then you are in a bind, because if you want global scale in these, large manufactured products, then you will have domestic monopolies, right? Or if you want to protect competition, you will have, problems of size. This is exactly what happened in the 70s with all these MRTP, etc., which killed domestic size, and we are still struggling with it, So I think we have to be very careful just in practical terms. So that's one issue, that it leads us with this issue of monopoly versus global scale. The second is that if you're focusing only on the domestic market, then you have to deepen that market, right? So the redistribution point comes in, that who's going to buy? It can't be that, top 10% only, because it just will not support global scale manufacturing. So I think even if you think about it practically, not in terms of, these large free scale of free trade versus protectionism debates, I think this Atmanirbhar Bharat issue has to be dealt with. The debate has to be deepened, I think. I agree with you that with deglobalization and this China, issue, we are no longer living in the, pre-2008 world or pre-2016 world. But nevertheless, I think India's great opportunity continues to be as a trading nation, and if you look at this, the two broad global trends, one is deglobalization, the second is the movement of change, global change away from China, the China plus one strategy. And I think that India can actually, it's an empirical question, that what overpowers? Is the shrinking global trade going to overpower the shift from China, or the other way around? And I still feel India has a big opportunity to get those supply chains in, remain a trading nation.
Exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, so that's my view. I'm sorry, it's a little bit of a long answer.
No, I'll quickly add that obviously the first point I fully agree in what Dr. Rajdaksha said, quoting Dr. Bhagwati, and which is I think partially why the government is doing the PLI kind of things, subsidies for. So it's not just, they're not only doing trade policy, they're also doing industrial policy. And I would actually make a point against our case, which Dr. Niranjan would definitely have made had he more time, is there is also the risk of crony capitalism going down the road. There is always a risk of, if you do too much industrial and trade policy. So that point is conceded in abstract. I'll simply say that, okay, on the practical point, because Rajiv and I are investors. So we follow the public markets. So for example, in public markets, there is no car manufacturer in the world which has not tried to come to India, and including 10 years ago when the market was even smaller. In industry after industry, the 3 trillion is not just 3 trillion. There is also the siren song of $10 trillion in 10 years, right? I mean, people are also looking forward. And what happened is Ford kind of said, okay, fine, we'll do a JV with Mahindra. We are not doing very well. GM kept its factory and said, we'll use it to export to the rest of the world, the global south, smaller cars. but we are not going to close the factory. We won't sell within India. Toyota was complaining, but who's the biggest car manufacturer in India? Suzuki, another Japanese company. Who's number two? Hyundai. And Hyundai's cousin Kia is also doing very well. So in industry after industry, despite what Niranjan said and what economists wrote, I think a couple of years ago, about the Indian market being small, the fact remains that there is no global multinational which is not trying to come to India. So there's still there is clearly something they're looking forward to, maybe not in the present. And on the point of I will simply say that the supply chains part, that's absolutely correct. We need to somehow, and I think Arvind Subramanian had a piece recently where he said that India has actually done very well in exports, contrary to popular narratives. And therefore, his argument was, to that extent, let us not go towards an export pessimism. And I understand and I see that point, and definitely Rajiv and I think that there is a lot of scope in services exports in which we are not having any kind of tariffs, although there is an element of digital nationalism that might come in later on. But I think the point is, which industry are we missing out with a 10% tariff over 5 years? We have to keep in sight that we are not talking about 50, 100% tariff. When America had a 40%, there was nothing called these global super shippers, these massive standardized container boxes. 10% is nothing in the larger scheme of things. So sometimes it is just about jumpstarting a local industry when you do not have capacity utilization above, say, 75% if you go by RBI numbers. See, it was very different in 2000, the bubble or the boom from 2003 to 8, and then the fiscal stimulus from 9-10 to 2012 till the taper tantrum, because Indian industry was absolutely sold out. We had no spare capacity. China had joined WTO a few years ago, so we finally imported it, and we kept inflation down to the extent we could have, though we still ended up being in double digits. Right now, the question is, we are refusing to have loose monetary policy. We can discuss that in a moment in terms of how we are anchoring it or not. How do we make sure that there is incentive for private capex for our domestic guys, even if tactically, even if for 3-4 years? So maybe a looser currency might be better, and very small moderate tariffs or few time bound, and some PLIs and a bit of all of it. But all of us agree that we do not want heavy permanent protectionism. I think that's very clear.
No, and we also have open FDI, like you mentioned, Harsh. I think I would just add one more point that we talked about exchange rates, but I think what is also worth mentioning is the cost of capital. So Indian business has been struggling with some of the highest cost of capital on the planet. Now, why that is so is connected to RBI's policy, keeping rates higher. Some would argue the rates were kept too high for too long. And that sort of hamstrung Indian industry in some ways, made them less competitive in some ways. Maybe like Harsh said, we are solving for the stronger rupee by having a moderate tariff.
3-4 days ago, I think maybe 1 week ago, and rightly that actually since the inflation targeting had started, our average CPI has been 4%.
Yeah.
So they've actually not, RBI has
and also the inflation target is 4 plus minus 2, right?
The question is, okay, 4% was hit.
But in the RBI's mind, it has become 4.
Like,
for whatever
if we had
reason.
a lower nominal interest rate, could we still have had gone 4%, right? I mean, what is the correlation? What is the short-term one-to-one linear causation? So I just want to kind of nuance.
And also the inflation target is 4 plus minus 2, right?
Yeah, and also they were supposed to do
it over. But in the RBI's
over,
mind, it has become 4 for whatever reason.
Yeah. 4 became the ceiling for some time. Although that's obviously not the case right now for the last.
But the real rate
months.
was
disagree about CPI versus WPI, and Karan knows that very well. But my point was, yes, inflation they hit the target, but unka humne kya real interest rates humne compared to the world, did we keep it very high? So it's not like they missed on inflation. They actually did not miss on inflation. The question is
the real rate was too high.
The question is more on the real rate.
Yeah.
So just one last issue about this, how do you encourage private investment? And, actually what you're saying, Harsh, is correct. Like, our differences are not as serious as they seem. But again, it goes back to that, Professor Bhagwati's point. I think that the solution is not import tariffs, but domestic policies or even subsidies, as long as they are WTO compliant, because we are in the WTO. So this the telecom thing has obviously worked, right? It's open, it's very clear. So I'm not saying that the government should just sit back and do nothing. I'm just saying that between domestic intervention and trade intervention, I would prefer domestic intervention. Another thing, just before we come back to the monetary fiscal issue, it's interesting in your book, as I said, you mentioned this about what is tradable, what is not tradable, it keeps changing. And, as supply chains are moving out of China, textiles, like everybody knows Vietnam and Bangladesh are big. But it's interesting that a lot of garments business has gone to Czechoslovakia and Spain, they're not the classic low wage islands, right? Now, it's interesting to know why, because a friend of mine told me this, that because of social media, the entire garment business has become this fast fashion, so Zara's fast fashion. And if
Staying close
fashions
to the customer.
change, exactly,
Yeah.
if fashions change every month and Zara is basically churning its, displays every month, there is no way they can source material from Vietnam or get those factories to move at the same pace. So a lot of, sitting on all this, besides the geopolitics, the technology and the impact of social media may change trade patterns, but that's a separate issue. I think you'll have raised some very, very good points in your chapter on these issues.
No, actually, just to add to that on the technology part, so social media is one. Then there's direct commerce, right? Direct to consumer commerce, where you don't even need to go to a retail store, and people are simply buying online, and buying online even internationally. So all these trends. In fact, in one of my essays for Mint, I had argued that technology itself has kind of a deflationary capacity expanding impact. What we've seen with technology, we've seen that, and even with some structural reforms like GST, that well-known story now about how trucks are doing more turnarounds. There's better asset utilization in logistics. So as a result, people are buying fewer trucks because the trucks are able to be more productive. So I think structural reform combined with technology has kind of capped capacity utilization to some
Actually, I
degree
want
in
to
India
ask
for a
a
long time.
question on the
I
role
think
of
that effect
technology,
also is
since we
actually worth
talk
studying.
about individual rights, markets and stuff. So a lot of the online platforms, so to say, now resemble what a free market would look like. Earlier, the idea was that a perfectly free or a perfect market does not exist, but a lot of these platforms have emerged to be similar to how a perfect market would function, although they are not sort of owned explicitly by a government entity. So this brings me back to the question of state versus private markets and whether such platforms can be privately held, and what it really means for efficiency enhancement, or rather monopolizing of the markets going forward rather than monopolizing of the business.
No, actually, this topic is one of the most interesting ones right now in antitrust and most
competition law
interesting
research.
areas of research. I don't think anyone has an answer yet on how this should be regulated. How these tech platforms, whether it's Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Instagram, how should they be regulated? Are they network monopolies? If they should be broken up, I don't think they should be broken up by
But I think it's
a
one of
writ
the
of
most
government.
interesting
But I
areas
think these
of
are the
research. I
most
don't think
cutting edge
anyone has an
questions
answer
right
yet
now,
on
actually.
how this should be regulated.
In that area.
How these tech platforms, whether it's Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Instagram, how should they be regulated? Are they network monopolies? If they should be broken up, I don't think they should be broken up by a writ of government. But I think these are the most cutting edge questions right now, actually.
I think that's a very important question, as Rajiv mentioned, network monopoly, right? So in economics, you call it positive network externalities. When something becomes bigger, and therefore it becomes even bigger because people on all sides join the platform and nobody else wants to go any other platform, right? Uber is a classic example. Facebook is a classic example. So the question is, if that is a situation, uh, how does conventional economics apply to that? And what China did, for example, when it made the Great Firewall, which comes from the Great Wall, is they said, we now understand your technologies. We simply create a platform and they'll become giants in China, which is what happened. And now India obviously is geopolitically aligned with the US, even though it's not a former treaty ally. We trust the data being on their servers, although we're trying to localize that. But even there are tensions. For example, Paytm recently was angry about the Android App Store kind of deplatforming under whatever reason, fair, unfair. And therefore, there was a big movement to have our own operating systems or our own super apps or mega apps. And I think this kind of tension will not go away. And the reason is because all the profits are going to California, right? I mean, the American market cap is almost $40 trillion right now, and Indian market cap is $2 trillion. That's a 20x difference, versus the GDP difference is 7x. And the question is, how long will people tolerate such a massive concentration of profits, when it is very obvious that by simply deplatforming somebody and copying the technology, you can easily have the India scale. This is again similar to that kind of market monopoly power in trade, except it's much more magnified here, especially if you look forward 5-10 years. So my sense is India will use this as leverage for the kind of trade services that Rajiv and Dr. Rajshaksha mentioned. For example, with 4G, 5G, AR, VR, if somebody can be a professor at NYU from teaching via Zoom or some kind of holographic entity, or be a receptionist in an office in Manhattan, you've not seen any outsourcing yet. You've seen blue collar outsourcing, but when you start seeing real white collar outsourcing from the West to India, there'll be a lot of political pressure on them to clamp down. I think India will then use these platforms being allowed in India, like Facebook, Google, as leverage. I think that I personally see that's how it will play out.
So, Karan, if I may just add, completely agree with Rajiv and Harsh on this. And it's nobody knows for sure, right? It's a completely new beast we are dealing with. And I think there is this trade-off between innovation and, again, protecting your privacy as well. So I think the way the Europeans have gone with very heavy regulation, it actually helps the incumbents, for a startup to jump through so many regulatory hoops. So then, in a way, by overreaching on privacy, you are sort of sacrificing your startup ecosystem. But so I think it's a very, very complex issue. Two things, one is, like, among the things I've learned over the years, just like the state market is, the balance is a changing dynamic. I think I've realized that there is no thing called the market. There are different markets with different institutional structures and transaction costs. So I think we need to, while keeping an open economy, we need to understand the specificities of each market. And these platforms are definitely
absolutely
one
phenomenal.
We have to understand much more. Secondly, again, just, going back to what Harsh and Rajiv have written in the book, I think what we have done in these, creation of public digital goods is quite astonishing. My friend Monica Hallan had raised this issue once, that why is it that India is absolutely cutting edge on services? If you look at the way, and if you want to transfer money from one bank to the other in India, it's faster than Europe. You can do it in seconds. So, but we get our services right, but we don't get our manufacturing right. There's some huge, paradox here, which beyond the scope of this conversation. But I think what we have done in terms of these public digital goods, Aadhaar, India Stack, UPI, is quite astonishing. So again, while we, prefer the private sector, I think this is one area where, like, the commanding heights of the digital economy, there is a decent case for the state to be a player here, because especially since these private markets also they're both the platform and operators, it's a conflict of interest, right? So it's known that some of these large private companies, if they find something is doing well, they just copy that product and sell it on there, and they have the algorithm to understand who's going to buy it. So I think these
actually,
are
on the
emerging
point
issues in
of the
regulation.
digital
but I really
public goods,
agree
I think
that
Niranjan is
India
absolutely
has a
right.
chance to leapfrog.
India is at the
just like
forefront.
we did in telecom.
It is
that
ground zero for.
from zero, we suddenly went to a completely networked country. I think this is a great opportunity.
Yeah, I fully agree.
Actually, on the point of the digital public goods, I think Niranjan is absolutely right. India is at the forefront. It is ground zero for fintech in the world. And what we've built with UPI, with Aadhaar, enabling all kinds of, the Aadhaar AEPS, Aadhaar enabled payment system, which has been the backbone for the entire cash transfer through the pandemic, actually. So I think India is the only country in the world which has this kind of a system. And, at a crisis of this type, at a time of such a crisis, to have this kind of technology is really a superpower.
And thank you to Nandan Nilikani and the entire team for that. I mean, it also shows that, a few good technocrats, people who excel in the private sector, if they go and get the right platform and the right political leadership, they can really transform a country. As Niranjan said, they can leapfrog. And, it's very interesting that Bharat Pay and all these things so threatened MasterCard and Visa that they were actually lobbying the American government to
Yes.
lobby the Indian government.
Yes.
That why is the Prime Minister of India advertising Bharat Pay? This is not good, because their entire model is a network, right? The network of small fees transaction costs.
Yeah.
And now actually our stack, our Bharat Pay and all that is going to Singapore and Dubai. What happens is they lobbied the Federal Reserve back home, saying that this should never happen through what Niranjan rightly called, what we've called in the book, digital public goods. They want all of that in the private sector. But some things don't make sense in the private sector. Now, you don't have to be that ideological about it if it is working very well. So I think in this case, we must be appreciative of what India has achieved and what hopefully they'll continue to achieve. I have lived in India, Hong Kong, Singapore, US, UK, and it's easiest to transfer money in India unless things have radically changed of late.
This is so from the world where I spend a lot of time, the world of startups and venture. So this is, you talk to people who are active investors in this, and hands down, I mean, there's no debate on this that India is the leader over here globally. What we've done with payments and fintech is absolutely off the charts, actually.
Yeah. So coming back to the issue, you mentioned that digital goods should be held whether in the private or the public sector. So I keep coming back to this one discussion in this particular chapter 4, where you're talking about capitalism and freedom, and what it essentially means is that is a more sort of ideologically to the right kind of a framework. So the discussion that we seem to be having is probably indicating that we have moved slightly away from a more sort of free market, or a more sort of on your face free market kind of an ideology. So I really want to understand what really caused such a transition, and whether that brings you a bit closer to Niranjan sir's views about the role of state and market in the Indian context.
No, what I would point to that, earlier in the discussion, Niranjan was mentioning, this is a dynamic, right? What should the government do? What should the private sector do? It's always a dynamic sort of interaction. And I think what drives that is technology. So the technology of the day actually determines whose role is what. And in recent years, we have seen technology go in a direction where many things which conventionally you could have said this is for the private sector to do. Well, in India, we have shown that these kind of digital public goods make the world a better place for everybody. It's pro competition, it's pro consumer. So again, like those kind of binaries of right, left, free versus non-free, Stalinist versus Friedmanite, whatever you want to call it. I think there is a case for reassessing that, because I mean, one of my broader themes, I often talk about this, that we are living with industrial revolution era kind of mindsets, but now we are in the digital era, and going further into the crypto era actually, and then many more changes will come there. So some kind of intellectual flexibility is very important.
You cannot have a venture capitalist talking without mentioning crypto. एक बार तो बोलना ही था. No, I mean, I'll just.
I think it's legit. I mean, many of the intellectual frameworks which we use today were actually created, in the post sort of industrial revolution period, in the early part of the 20th century. When labor was an issue, for example, then you had certain types of labor laws coming in, labor protections.
So I'll just quickly add, Karan, to that. Think about privatizing something like railways. And what, some countries have done it well, some countries have done it not so well, some countries have done it partially. But logically, it makes sense to maybe privatize or sell or auction slots for trains to run on tracks that are owned by the government. So that's how I see it. I see the state's role as a facilitator, and where there is a natural monopoly, so long as they're not terribly inefficient, I am not ideological and I'm okay with them owning it. And which is actually the direction Indian Railways is now going in. They're talking about private trains. They're talking about private freight trains. It might take
Who
a
would
few
have
years.
thought?
Yeah, who would have thought exactly? I mean, to be fair, actually, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, as candidate Narendra Modi, had mentioned that, I think, in a couple of speeches in 2013 and 14. But we were kind of dismissive of
Yes.
that in the first few years. But he's actually stuck to his guns to that extent. So so a private train makes sense, but a private track does not make sense. I mean, that's kind of a way to imagine, because it's difficult to visualize digital goods. It might be easier to visualize this better, slightly better.
No, and actually on the naysayer always say, look what happened under Thatcher in the UK, it was a disaster. Well, the right case study I think to follow is what Japan has done, and I suspect the Japanese, behind the scenes, they would be advising the Indian government, they would be working with India to help us do this properly.
Niranjan, do you want to add something on that?
No, I'm completely in agreement, and I don't want to challenge Rajiv on crypto. No, just joking. But I agree with you. When we said that a lot of these things are contextual, absolutely, Rajiv. Technology plays a big part. The global geopolitical situation plays a big part. So I don't think you can sort of put things into neat buckets. As long as overall the economy remains competitive and entry and exit is easy, and the public goods are in place, I think that's what we should look at.
So before we end, let's just ask a very simple question, and we'll start with Dr. Niranjan. Since the idea of India has often been discussed or sort of attributed to the Nehruvian socialism ideas, and that has obviously changed and evolved since then. Now we have a new idea of India, which actually brings back the philosophical discussion of what really should be considered as India, whether it's a civilizational state or whether it's a modern nation state, whether the two are compatible, what is the role of individual rights, etc., etc. So my question is that since you mentioned that a lot of these things are contextual, do you foresee that this new idea of India may differ 10 years down the line, and we would have a new idea of India, say in 2030 or maybe in 2040, compared to the one that we're discussing today?
See, it's a tough question. Let me put it this way. Obviously, in any society, there are some things which are changing, but there is also a bedrock of values. Those values may come from your history, from your religion, from your culture, from your interaction with the rest of the world. It's a lot of things. I still feel that the original Indian constitution, right, the constitution passed in 1950, I think is still the best bet. It's the same reason I feel that everything, for all the flaws, I think our best bet is the Indian nation state. And underlying that Indian nation state is the Indian constitution. Now, you may argue that should the state be centralized or federal, should it be this or that, but just this, the idea of India, according to me, is exactly the idea of India which was, decided upon in January of 1950, right? And the Indian nation state has been built on it. And I, for one, believe that the Indian constitution is not divorced from Indian civilizational values. The original constitution, I have to keep making this, this thing.
Very important distinction.
Yes, absolutely. So,
I meant more in the economic context, the sort of new idea of India, say 20 years down the line, because it's becoming increasingly difficult anyway to change the constitution, the way it's designed, and then the way we have a basic structure doctrine.
Yeah, no, I'm not a fan. I think the Indian constitution is fine, right? Means there are generally, I think it has served us well. Generally, the Indian nation state has served us well. So I'm very clear about that. And as I said, that I think that it's not something which was dreamt up on one day. It has a history. It goes back into our past. So I think even the cover of this book, right? It's from the Ramayana.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
This is the cover of the Indian Constitution.
So this illustration actually is from the fundamental rights section of the original Constitution of India. And that illustration comes from it is a scene from the Ramayana.
So therefore, I never buy this argument that the Indian constitution is not embedded in Indian civilizational values. So it is a modern reforming state. So we can go into that because of, we had to break the caste system, etc.
Yeah.
But as far as economic policy goes, I think we've had various stages. I think we had the high noon of Nehruvian economics from 1950 to 65 or even 70. Then you had the 70 to 90, the years of more or less of stagnation, which is when we actually fell behind the rest of Asia. Lots of wrong moves, some early liberalization. Then you had the 91 moment under Narasimha Rao, Manmohan Singh. Then you had the Vajpayee government, which really did a lot of reforms. Unfortunately, the second Manmohan Singh government, the first years were excellent economic record, but they didn't push the reforms agenda as much as one would have hoped. I think we are moving into stage 4, right? So if stage 3 is the 91 framework, and I think nobody should pretend that they have the answers. I don't think Rajiv and Harsh are pretending either. But as I said, many of the
which is why we. It is not a definitive in the title.
So, but I think a lot of the issues they have raised in the book, we cannot think about that 4th stage without grappling with some of these issues. Whether an agreement or disagreement is up to each individual. But as I said, it's very, very perceptive chapter.
And I just want to quickly add, just on a separate note, most of Niranjan's writings are about economics. And I don't want to discuss politics on this podcast, but I would encourage people to Google Niranjan's name and Savarkar. Like, he has actually written very nuanced views away from kind of caricatures of Savarkar. I think even translated some stuff in Mint, and I think that's very important, because the reason why I'm mentioning Savarkar is, as we agree, Rajiv and I, that the constitutional and civilizational views are not at loggerheads; they're actually integrated with each other. We do write, as Karan kind of hinted towards the end in chapter 5, that we do think the basic structure doctrine should go away so that the constitution can be properly amended if and when needed in a constitutional manner itself. But that's a separate issue. So what Savarkar did more than anything else is he said, okay, there is this underlying civilization. We need to convert it into a modern nation, and the instrumentality of that is a modern state and a modern democratic state. And I think that more than anything else, and Savarkar in that sense was very similar to Ambedkar and even Nehru to some extent, right? I mean, they're all modernizers. I mean, maybe Gandhi was the last genuinely traditionalist,
absolutely,
in that sense. Everybody else, the Indian, if you think about it, without going to BJP and Congress, the Indian electorate has always gone for modernizers. No matter, again, you don't have to use that word modernizer, because then there are connotations of westernization and there are all these kind of sophomoric debates. But even Narendra Modi is talking about, women having periods from Lal Killa. And he's talking about women's safety and teaching your sons and not the daughters and all that. So I think the broad concept, we talk about individual rights, and, a lot of economics which we've not discussed, which we've written more in chapter 3, is about the views that how economic freedom actually breaks down social discrimination. For example, religion-based discrimination, how a more functioning judicial and contract system breaks down caste system, and hence allows for entrepreneurs to transact across their immediate social circles and have broader social capital. So economics is fundamentally linked to India becoming a modern nation. Prosperity has to go hand in hand with social reform. I mean, you just cannot have two parallel systems going in different directions. And one of the guys who's underappreciated, one of the persons, the historical figures who's written very well about it, who's conceptualized it, is Veer Savarkar. And if you read of him about the caste system, or even in the cases of very sensitive issues like cow worship or beef and all that, he has some heterodox views, which are not what you would expect from somebody who is now labeled the way he is labeled. And therefore, always read people like Savarkar and Ambedkar more than just assume, or even Nehru, for that matter. Yeah.
So, just before Rajiv comes in, Harsh, really well argued, and in Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste, which is like one of his great works, there's a very, very good line there where he says that the caste system is not just a division of labor, but also the division of laborers. And the idea being basically that the caste system comes in the way of building a nation. And, see, Ambedkar's end goal was always an Indian nation. It was, obviously he had to represent the Dalits because they had a really bad deal in history. So I think that's a very, very, and frankly, if you ask me again, it goes back to a Nehru issue that if you read some of Nehru's works, I think that shows immense pride in Indian civilization.
We have quoted that in the book. We have quoted that in the book, the 1961
yeah,
lecture, the 1948 lecture.
Absolutely. Sorry, Rajeev. Over to you.
No, so I was just going to say, one argument that you often hear from the leftist sort of thinking people in India is that markets are not moral. Somehow they're immoral, and this kind of consumerism is a bad thing, and we should be ashamed of wasting and all that stuff. I mean, in chapter 4, we really try to push back against that view because, frankly, as professors Bhagwati and Panagaria have shown, growth creates resources. Resources empower the state, and the state is there to sort of first and foremost take care of individual citizens of India, the security, their welfare. So without growth, even the state gets weakened, which damages all of us. Not just whether you're rich, whether you're poor, it damages everybody. So the moral case for markets really comes from the criticality of the state in a sort of ironic sense for some people. They may take it ironically, but I think in closing, I would say that, it's not a dichotomy. In fact, a strong market system requires a strong state, a strong but limited state.
Raji, what is the name of the Chicago economist who argued that discrimination is reduced with more market?
Gary Becker. Gary Becker. Yes.
So I think Gary Becker is.
So we've written extensively about Becker's work on his thesis was on the economics of discrimination. Really path-breaking sort of analysis by him on how he says that discrimination actually hurts those who are discriminating.
Yeah.
And he sort of empirically established that, for which he won the Nobel Prize. And I think it's very relevant in the Indian context for whether it is caste discrimination, whether it is religion-based discrimination. But having said that, we also have said in the book on how certain types of discrimination can also come down to individual choice. And that has been established in Indian jurisprudence.
No, so interestingly, there's a very extensive discussion on this paper that you have just referred by Gary Becker. And for those who haven't really read the book, I would urge them to get a copy and read it. Because, there are these sort of interesting takeaways on how economics really shapes up a lot of the social outcomes and how economic development cannot be disjoined from social progress.
So one of these sections is called Dalit capitalism and market feminism.
Yeah.
And the reason we use market feminism because there is actually an academic discipline called Marxist feminism.
Yeah.
Actual academic discipline. So we just kind of deliberately had a play on words. And in Dalit capitalism, we quote scholars such as Chandrabhan Prasad, who says that that capitalism is an entire social system which dissolves the caste system. It's an entire system in that sense. And we obviously quote Ambedkar saying that I'm very glad that the Indian Constitution saw the Indian individual as the unit of state policy and not the Indian village. And I think he was hinting at Gandhiji's thinking there. So there are these things which occasionally we think are settled debates, but they keep on coming back in a weird way. So it's important to reiterate. And a lot of these social reformers from places like Maharashtra, Bengal, rest of the country, we have forgotten how much we are standing on the shoulders of these giants. And you cannot classify these giants as left or right. And I'll just, from my side, I'll say the final thing is, one of the things we try, this is not a right-wing book. We personally don't like the word left and right because we don't think it applies in any political context, definitely not in the Indian context. When whether it comes to abortion or gay rights or attitudes to blasphemy amongst religious extremists of the majority or the minority, these things don't fall on a left-right scale in India. And increasingly, as we've discussed in this episode, even economics has become much more muddled and nuanced. Yeah. So we still use it as a shorthand, because some people call themselves left, so we are also now calling right. But personally, I think that is really something that should be left at the French Revolution. I don't think it applies to us, and I'll leave it at that. Niranjan, do
Agree.
you want to summarize on some aspect?
No, I have nothing. It's now that's the past. I'm looking at the future for book number 2.
Yes. Let's hope so. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much for joining us today. To Niranjan sir, and of course to both the authors, Harsh sir and Rajiv sir, for this brilliant discussion.